My name is Richard Hayes. I am 56 years old and I live in the industrial heart of Cleveland, Ohio, where the winters are unforgiving and the factories whistle long into the night. And for most of my life, I believed that hard work and sacrifice were the only currencies a father needed to build a future for his children. I spent 3 decades in the steel plant, sweating through double shifts, breathing in dust and fire. Also, my family could live comfortably, so my daughter Emily could wear nice clothes to school, go on field trips, and one day walk across a stage in a cap and gown while I stood in the crowd, clapping with tears in my eyes, believing it was all worth it. When my wife Margaret passed away 5 years ago, a piece of my soul went into the grave with her. But Emily became my anchor, swearing she would never leave me alone. And I held on to that promise like it was scripture, telling myself that though life had taken my wife, it had left me a daughter who loved me. But last winter, after a heart attack nearly killed me, I came home from the hospital frail and broken, expecting warmth and care, only to step inside and see that my house looked like a stranger's home. The walls bare of family photos, my old rocking chair missing, my clothes gone from the closet, and standing at the doorway was Emily, my own child, with her arms crossed and her eyes colder than the Cleveland wind as she said, "Dad, this isn't your home anymore. You can't stay here." Words that pierced deeper than any surgery scar, because in that instant I realized the life I had built, the love I had given, had been dismantled while I was lying helpless in a hospital bed, and all I could do was stare at her, my voice trembling as I whispered her name, wondering how the little girl I once carried on my shoulders at the county fair had grown into the woman now pushing me out into the winter night, like I was a stranger begging at her door. I remember that night as if it is carved into my bones, the night I stood outside my own house shivering in the biting Cleveland air, staring at the window where the warm light glowed, the light that used to mean safety, laughter, and family dinners. But now it felt like a taunt, a cruel reminder that I no longer belonged there. And as I leaned against the wooden fence that I myself had painted years ago with Emily helping beside me, her little hands dripping with white paint as she giggled when we left handprints on the boards, I wondered how a bond that strong could rot into such bitterness. I thought of the sacrifices. Every Christmas I worked overtime so she would have gifts beneath the tree. Every birthday when I skipped meals just so I could buy her the cake she wanted. And yet, standing there that night, none of it seemed to matter, because my daughter had chosen comfort and control over compassion. And behind her decision I could feel the shadow of her husband, Daniel, a man who always looked at me like I was some relic taking up space. Like my years of sweat and labor were meaningless compared to his shiny business suits and empty smile. And I knew in my heart that Emily's words were not entirely her own, but poisoned by the whispers of a man who convinced her that her old father was a burden, a weight dragging her down. And as I clutched the only bag I had, a small hospital sack with my medicine, a pair of socks, and my wallet, I walked down the dark street with tears freezing on my cheeks, asking myself how many fathers before me had lived to see their children turn away, how many had died alone in rooms not their own. And I thought about Margaret, my wife, wishing she could have been there, because I knew if she were alive none of this would have happened. She would have fought for me, reminded Emily of the blood that ties us, and as I staggered past the corner store where the cashier used to greet me by name, I felt invisible, nameless, like a ghost haunting the city I had given my entire life to, and all I could do was whisper to myself in the cold silence, "I am Richard Hayes. I am a father. I am still alive," as though repeating my name was the only shield I had left against the crushing weight of betrayal. I kept walking that night, my legs trembling not only from the bitter Cleveland wind, but from the storm in my chest, and every step seemed to echo with memories that cut deeper than any knife could. Because this wasn't just a walk down an empty street. It was a journey through my entire life. Each corner reminding me of sacrifices I made. Each crack in the pavement reminding me of moments I thought I had secured a future for my daughter. And yet the future had betrayed me. I remembered the first time Emily rode her bike down Maple Avenue, her laughter filling the air as I ran beside her, steadying her until she learned balance, and I remembered how she fell, scraped her knees and ran crying into my arms, trusting that her father could heal every wound with a simple hug. And I thought, where is that little girl now? How did she grow into someone who could push me into the cold night like a stray dog? And then the face of Daniel, her husband, appeared in my mind like a dark cloud, his smug smirk whenever I tried to give advice, his sharp comments about how the house should be run, how money should be spent, how traditions didn't matter anymore, and I realized that maybe this wasn't just Emily's betrayal, but also the success of his slow poison dripping into her heart over the years. And the realization hurt more than the night air tearing into my lungs. As I trudged toward the bus stop, my breath fogging in the darkness, I saw the old diner where Margaret and I used to go every Friday night, and it felt like I was walking through a graveyard of memories, each one rising to haunt me, because when she was alive, home had been a sanctuary, a place where love guarded every corner. But since she passed, the cracks had widened, and Daniel slid in like a snake through those cracks, wrapping himself around my daughter until she was no longer mine but his, and the bitter truth clawed at me. Home was no longer home. My daughter was no longer my daughter, and I was no longer a father but an unwanted relic, discarded like yesterday's newspaper. I sat at the bus stop bench, my bones aching, clutching the bag the hospital had given me, and as cars passed by, no one looked twice at the old man with watery eyes and trembling hands. And in that moment, I understood what loneliness truly meant. Not the quiet kind when you sit alone in a room, but the brutal kind when you are surrounded by a world that has forgotten your name, when your own flesh and blood closes the door in your face. And I whispered into the empty air, I am Richard Hayes, from Cleveland, Ohio, a father, a man who gave everything. As if saying it louder might make someone care. But the wind swallowed my words, carrying them away like they meant nothing. Yet even as despair weighed down on me, some stubborn ember deep inside refused to die. Because I thought of Margaret, and how she always said, Richard, no matter how hard the storm, a father's love doesn't end, it endures. And I clung to that like a lifeline. Because maybe one day Emily will wake up from the shadow Daniel has cast on her heart. Maybe she'll remember the man who carried her on his shoulders, who taught her to read, who sacrificed meals, who never once thought of himself first. And maybe then she'll open the door, call me by my name and not send me to live in the cold world where I am nothing but a ghost in my own story. But as I sat there on that frozen bench, staring at the flickering streetlight above me, I realized the cruelest betrayal wasn't just that Emily had pushed me away. It was that she had taken the word home and turned it into a stranger. For decades, that word was sacred. It meant warmth, safety, Margaret's cooking, Emily's laughter, Christmas mornings filled with joy instead of gifts. But now it meant exile, rejection, and the reminder that no matter how much love you give, sometimes the world pays you back with silence and slammed doors. And as I rubbed my trembling hands together to fight the cold, my mind drifted back further, to the days when I was young, strong, full of fire, working double shifts at the steel plant, my back breaking but my heart steady because every hour I spent under the hiss of machinery was another dollar toward Emily's future. Another brick laid for the foundation of her dreams, and I never complained. Never cursed my luck because that's what fathers do. They bend until they almost break. They bleed silently, they go without so their children can go with. And now to think that the very child I sacrificed for looked me in the eye and pointed to a doghouse as if to say, that is where you belong, felt like being crucified by my own flesh. And it wasn't just betrayal, it was annihilation, the erasing of everything I believed love could protect. I remembered the night Margaret passed. The sterile smell of the hospital, her hand weak in mine, her last words trembling on her lips, take care of Emily. And I had promised, through tears and choking grief, that I would, no matter the cost, and I had kept that promise every day. But sitting here now, I wondered if I had failed her, if somehow in trying to give Emily the world I had left her unguarded against the wolves, against Daniel's manipulations. And maybe my love had been too soft, too trusting, too blind. A bus roared past without stopping. the sound shaking me back into the present, and I realized the night was only going to get colder, the world only darker. Yet I stayed seated, clinging to memories like they were blankets, thin and frayed, but all I had. And in the hollow silence I whispered Margaret's name, hoping somehow her spirit could hear me, could send me strength, because I was lost in a world that had no compass anymore. And then another thought crept in. What if this was the end of my story? Not with peace, not with dignity, but with loneliness on a bus stop bench. A man who gave his all only to be forgotten, but before despair could crush me completely. That ember of stubborn love inside flared again, and I told myself, "No, Richard. You are still a father. You are still a man who fought, who loved, who endured. And maybe Emily won't come. Back tomorrow, maybe not in a year, maybe never. But as long as I breathe, I will keep that door of love open, because even if she slammed hers shut, mine will never be locked. And maybe one day, when Daniel's mask falls, when life teaches her the weight of choices, she will remember. She will search for me. And when she does, I want her to find a father still standing, scarred but unbroken, waiting with the same love that raised her. Because if I let bitterness take me, then Daniel wins, the shadows win, and Margaret's memory is stained, and that I will never allow." So I sat there, broken yet unyielding, whispering my story into the night, letting the stars and the wind be my witnesses. Because even if the world forgets Richard Hayes of Cleveland, Ohio, the father who gave everything, I will never forget myself. And as long as memory and love burn inside me, I am not gone. I am not nothing. I am still here. I woke up the next morning with a heaviness in my chest that no amount of coffee could wash away. My name is Richard Miller, and I live in a small town in Oregon where life is supposed to be simple, quiet, and peaceful. But nothing about my home feels peaceful anymore. As I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper that once seemed charming, I thought about the way my daughter Emily had looked at me the night before. Her eyes, once full of trust and laughter, were sharp, cold, almost unrecognizable. I could still hear her words echoing, each syllable hitting me like a hammer. "Dad, maybe it's time you stop clinging to the past. You don't belong in, this house anymore." That house, the one I built with my own 2 hands, every corner of it carrying my sweat, my labor, my dreams. I remember laying the foundation myself, determined to create a home where my family would always feel safe. Now my daughter spoke as if I were a guest who had overstayed his welcome. I tried to convince myself she didn't mean it, that maybe her husband had influenced her, that maybe the stress of bills or her new responsibilities had made her lash out. But deep down I knew it wasn't just a slip of the tongue. Something was changing in her, something I couldn't understand. As I looked out the window at the quiet Oregon morning, the mist still hugging the pines, I felt like a stranger in my own life, trapped between the memory of what once was and the harsh truth of what it had become. I took a long breath that morning, staring out at the damp Oregon sky, the kind of gray that seemed to swallow the world whole. My name is Richard Miller, and for the last 62 years of my life, I've worked my hands raw to keep this house standing and my family cared for. I live in the small town of Brookings, a place where the ocean waves crash against the rocks with a sound so fierce it can shake your bones. Yet somehow, I've always found comfort in it. The people here know me as the man who can fix anything, a broken fence, a leaking roof, even an old boat engine, and I used to take pride in that because it meant I was useful, dependable, needed. But last night, when my own daughter Emily looked me in the eye and told me I didn't belong here anymore, every bit of usefulness I thought I had crumbled into dust. I spent the night tossing and turning, haunted by memories of her childhood. The way she'd cling to my hand when she was scared of thunderstorms. The way she used to say, "Daddy, promise me you'll never leave me." I never broke that promise, not once, and yet here I was, being pushed out of the very home I built for her. The pain in her voice wasn't just a knife. It was a twisting blade, turning deeper every time I replayed her words in my head. I wondered how we reached this point. Was it her husband whispering poison into her ear, convincing her I was nothing but a burden? Or was it me? Had I unknowingly failed her, given her reasons to believe I was unworthy of the roof over my own head? The sun had barely risen, its weak light spilling into the kitchen as I made myself a cup of coffee, the bitter taste sharper than usual. Every corner of this house told a story, stories Emily seemed to have forgotten. The scar on the wooden dining table from when she knocked over a candle during her 16th birthday. The squeaky stair on the second floor that always gave away, her sneaky midnight trips to the kitchen. The flower bed in the backyard where she and her mother planted daisies, the ones I watered every morning after her mom passed, just so Emily would still see a piece of her mother's touch alive in this home. And now, all of those memories meant nothing to her, as if the weight of our history had been erased with a single cold sentence. I gripped my mug tighter, my knuckles turning white because I wasn't just losing my home, I was losing my daughter. The worst part? She didn't even seem to care. I heard her upstairs laughing with her husband, a laugh that once brought me joy but now felt like a dagger through my chest. It was as if she had chosen him, chosen his comfort, his opinions, his authority over me, the man who raised her, the man who gave up everything to ensure she never went without. I tried to swallow my pride, to remind myself she was an adult now. But pride wasn't the issue. Betrayal was. I stepped outside to clear my head, the cold Oregon air biting at my face. The pine trees stretched high into the fog, their silence more comforting than the walls of my own home. I thought about leaving, about packing my things and walking away with whatever dignity I had left, but where would I go? This house is more than wood and brick. It's my blood, my history, my very identity. I built it with my own two hands, for my wife, for Emily, for the family I thought would always stand together. And now I was expected to surrender it, to step aside like a shadow fading into the corner of their lives. The neighbors waved at me as I stood in the driveway, but I couldn't wave back. How could I explain that behind my front door the very family they admired was tearing itself apart? How could I admit that my daughter, the little girl they once saw riding her bike up and down this very street, was now the one casting me out like I was nothing but a worn-out old man? My chest tightened, my throat burned, and I realized that the house might survive, the walls might keep standing, but something inside me was collapsing. For the first time in my life, I felt small in a world I thought I had built strong enough to protect me. The silence that followed my daughter's words that night was heavier than any storm I had ever lived through. It wrapped itself around me like chains, suffocating me with every second that passed. I, Richard Wallace of Denver, Colorado, a man who had worked his whole life in the oil fields, in construction, and even in the freezing nights as a truck driver to keep food on the table, now stood as nothing more than an intruder in the very house my calloused hands had and paid for. My daughter, Emily, stood there with her husband, their eyes cold and unrecognizable, as though the years of bedtime stories, scraped knee bandages, and nights I sat awake worrying for her safety had never existed at all. They told me I had become a burden, that my old ways didn't fit their new life, and that the room that had been mine was better suited for their future plans. The betrayal cut so deep that even my voice trembled when I tried to speak, reminding them that it was I who gave everything, I who sacrificed every joy so that Emily could have hers. But instead of a flicker of guilt or even hesitation, she pointed to the backyard where, under the dim porch light, I saw an old, broken-down shed they had cleaned just enough to make space for a cot. "That's where you'll sleep now, Dad," she said, her words stabbing harder than any knife, each syllable echoing in my chest like a hammer pounding nails into a coffin. My legs felt weak, but my pride held me upright as I walked out, each step dragging the weight of memories with me. Her first bike I fixed, the nights I skipped meals so she could eat, the graduation I had cheered for with tears in my eyes, believing my sacrifice meant something. And now that same child had turned into a stranger, casting me out like discarded trash, leaving me to wonder how love so pure could rot into something so cruel. I lay on that cot, the air cold and damp, staring up at the rotting ceiling boards, asking God if this was the reward for a lifetime of sacrifice, or if perhaps the real betrayal wasn't hers alone, but mine too, for raising her to believe love had no limits, only to learn that hers did. That night, lying on the damp cot inside that shed, I couldn't sleep. The sounds of crickets outside mixed with the occasional barking dog in the distance, and each noise only reminded me of the silence I used to cherish in my own room, the room I had worked decades to earn, the room I had once filled with photos of Emily growing up, the room that now belonged to her and her husband while I was left in the cold. My name is Richard Wallace, 62 years old, a man who thought he had lived an honest life here in Denver, Colorado, a man who believed that blood, sweat, and sacrifice always carried meaning. Yet, as I stared into the darkness, I realized that meaning can be stripped away in a single moment when the ones you love most decide your worth has expired. My mind drifted back to my younger years when my late wife, Margaret, and I would sit on this same porch where Emily had pointed toward my exile, watching the sunset and dreaming about the future. We had promised each other that no matter how hard life became, we would make sure our daughter had everything we didn't. And I kept that promise, working overtime shifts in oil fields, driving long-haul trucks through icy mountain passes, breaking my back and wearing out my bones until one day my body started to betray me with aches and weakness I could no longer ignore. When Margaret passed away, I told myself at least I still had Emily, that the bond between father and daughter would keep me standing even when loneliness tried to bury me alive. But now, with Margaret gone and Emily's heart colder than steel, I found myself wondering if I had been blind all along, raising a daughter who took and took but never truly understood the weight of giving. The shed smelled of mold, the wooden beams above me groaned with every gust of wind, and in that fragile silence I questioned everything. Was love nothing but a story we tell ourselves to make sacrifice bearable? Was I a fool to believe that blood guaranteed loyalty, that family would never turn its back? My hands, scarred and hardened from decades of labor, trembled as I covered my face, trying to hide from the truth that screamed inside me. I was alone. Alone in a house I built. Alone in a family I raised. Alone in a world that seemed to have no place for fathers like me. Fathers who gave everything but kept nothing for themselves. And yet, somewhere deep inside, beyond the hurt and humiliation, a stubborn flame refused to die. I told myself that maybe, just maybe, this pain could forge me into something stronger. Because if my own daughter could push me this low, then the only way left for me to go was up. The next morning, when the first light of dawn crept through the cracks of the shed walls, I rose slowly, my joints stiff and my back aching from the hard wooden cot. And I realized that the man who once carried entire households on his shoulders was now being carried by shame and betrayal. I, Richard Wallace of Denver, Colorado, a man who had built a name of honesty among neighbors and colleagues, was reduced to hiding like a stranger in the very place I once called home. I thought about the neighbors who used to wave when I fixed the fences, the old friends who still remembered me as the man who would lend a hand without asking for anything in return, and I wondered, if they knew I was living in this shed, thrown away by my own daughter, what would they think? Would they pity me? Or would they quietly nod and say that this is the way of the world now, where children forget their roots as soon as they find comfort in wealth or marriage? My chest tightened with every breath as I remembered Emily's first steps, her first day at school, her first heartbreak, and how I had always been there, quietly supporting her without complaint. I remembered working nights just to buy her a piano she begged for when she was 13, and though she played it only for a year, before losing interest I never regretted it, because seeing her smile was worth more than the blisters on my hands. Yet today that same daughter looked at me with eyes empty of warmth, as though I were nothing but a burden, an old man taking up space. The sting wasn't just in her words or her actions. It was in the realization that somewhere along the way, I had lost her. That the little girl who once clung to my leg calling me her hero had grown into someone I could no longer recognize. My throat burned with the weight of words left unsaid, words I wanted to shout. Emily, I am your father, not your servant. I am the man who sacrificed his youth for your future. I am not trash to be swept into a shed. But the words stayed locked inside, because pride has a cruel way of chaining the tongue when the heart is already bleeding. As the day stretched on, I sat in that shed with memories flooding me like a storm. Holidays where Margaret cooked while Emily and I decorated the tree. Nights when we all sat around the fireplace laughing at silly jokes and the promise I made at Margaret's grave that I would protect our daughter with my last breath. And now, That promise felt broken, not because I didn't keep it, but because Emily no longer wanted it. The ache in my chest wasn't just heartbreak, it was grief. Grief for a daughter who was still alive but lost to me. Grief for a family that had died long before I realized it. Grief for the years I would never get back. Yet as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the yard, I clenched my fists and whispered to myself that this would not be the end of Richard Wallace. Because if the home I built could no longer shelter me, then maybe it was time to build a new one, even if my hands were old and weary. As the sun sank completely behind the mountains, leaving Denver bathed in the dim orange glow of dusk, I sat there in silence, my mind racing through every memory, every smile, and every tear I had shared with Emily. And I realized that clinging to the past would only keep me trapped in that shed, a prisoner of grief and bitterness, so I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling under the weight of years and sorrow, and I stepped out into the crisp evening air, feeling the rough gravel under my shoes and the wind biting at my face as if testing my resolve. And I decided then that I would not let this betrayal define the rest of my life. I would find work, I would find purpose, and perhaps I would find people who saw me not as an old, useless man, but as Richard Wallace, a father, a human being with dignity and pride, because even though Emily had turned her back, the world was still vast, full of opportunities and chances to rebuild what had been lost. I wandered down the quiet streets, passing houses glowing warmly from inside, and each light reminded me of what I had, a family that was gone, yet also a life that could still be reclaimed. And though the ache in my chest never fully left, I discovered that pain could coexist with hope if I allowed it. So I began, knocking on doors, offering to help neighbors with small chores, fixing fences, painting walls, doing what I had always done best. And slowly people began to notice, offering smiles, small nods, and eventually invitations to share a meal or a story. It was a fragile thread, but it was enough to remind me that life could continue, that I could matter again. Nights were the hardest, of course, when Emily's absence echoed like a gaping wound in my soul, and I would sit under the stars, talking quietly to the memory of her little hand in mine. And sometimes I would curse, sometimes I would weep, and sometimes I would simply sit in silence, letting the night wrap around me, letting it remind me that grief was part of the journey I had to endure. And yet, as days turned into weeks, I began to notice a change. Not in Emily, not yet, but in myself. The weight of despair slowly lifted as small victories accumulated. An elderly neighbor thanking me for fixing her porch, a young family laughing as I taught their son how to ride a bike, a local cafe owner letting me help in exchange for a cup of coffee. These moments stitched pieces of my shattered pride back together, and I realized that while my daughter's betrayal had cut deeply, it had not destroyed me, for Richard Wallace was still alive, still capable of love, kindness, and courage, still capable of creating bonds beyond blood, and that in itself was a victory. The city of Denver no longer felt like a place that had turned its back on me. It was a canvas, vast and unpainted, waiting for me to leave my mark, and I decided that even if Emily never returned, even if the family I had dreamed of protecting had vanished, I would carve a new story from the ruins, one that could one day be shared, remembered, and perhaps understood. Because life, in its cruel and beautiful way, always offered another chance to rise, and rise I would, with every ounce of strength left in these old bones until the world, and perhaps Emily herself, remembered that Richard Wallace was never to be underestimated. Days turned into months, and slowly the rhythm of life in Denver began to fill the empty spaces inside me that Emily's betrayal had carved out. Mornings were spent at the local hardware store, fixing tools, carrying lumber, and lending a hand to anyone who needed it, while afternoons were devoted to the small garden behind my modest apartment, where I planted flowers and vegetables, nurturing life as if to remind myself that growth was still possible even in the hardest soil. And in the evenings, I would walk along the river that cut through the city, watching the water glint under the fading light, listening to the soft hum of the wind and distant city sounds, and I realized that healing was not sudden, but a quiet accumulation of ordinary acts that stitched my broken spirit back together, that every kind word, every smile, and every small task done with care was a rebellion against the despair that had once threatened to swallow me whole. Yet even in these moments of quiet reconstruction, memories of Emily were never far, her voice echoing in my mind, a haunting reminder of loss and regret. And sometimes I found myself imagining what she might be doing, whether she thought of me or whether the life she had chosen brought her happiness at all. And though anger flared occasionally, I forced myself to breathe, to let those feelings pass like clouds over the city skyline, understanding at last that resentment could only chain me to the past, while forgiveness, whether she deserved it or not, was the key to my freedom. Friends began to appear in unexpected places. Mr. Jensen from the corner bakery, who always slipped me an extra loaf of bread with a wink. The shy teenager next door who taught me the nuances of modern music. Even the elderly woman from the park, who insisted I help her build a small birdhouse each week. These connections were fragile, but they were threads weaving a new tapestry of life that no betrayal could unravel. And slowly, the laughter and warmth that had been absent for so long returned, subtle at first, then more boldly, filling the rooms and streets with a sense of purpose I had feared lost forever. And through it all, I held on to the hope that one day Emily might see not the old broken man she thought she left behind, but the father who had endured, who had rebuilt himself with dignity, courage, and kindness, and who, despite the wounds life had inflicted, remained unbroken, capable of love, capable of joy, capable of rising again like the sun over the Rocky Mountains, fierce, relentless, and beautiful in its persistence. The months rolled on, and life in Denver transformed, from a mere survival into something I began to recognize as a fragile but precious kind of happiness. Every morning I woke before sunrise, brewed my coffee in the small kitchen of my modest apartment, and watched the city slowly stretch awake, the orange light bouncing off glass buildings and the distant mountains, reminding me that even in the midst of personal catastrophe, the world moved on, unyielding and indifferent yet beautiful, and I had a choice, to sink under the weight of betrayal or to stand and embrace the small joys that stitched themselves into the fabric of my days, like the warm greeting from the mailman who remembered my name, the way the squirrels played in the park near my apartment, or the way children laughed as they ran past the fountain downtown, blissfully unaware of adult heartbreak. Work at the hardware store became more than a job. It became a lifeline, connecting me to people who, though strangers, offered tiny fragments of humanity, from helping an elderly man reach a high shelf to fixing a leaky sink for a young couple, struggling to pay rent. In each connection was a quiet rebellion against the loneliness that had threatened to consume me after Emily's betrayal, a reminder that while love can shatter, compassion can rebuild, brick by brick, moment by moment. And slowly, as I tended my little garden behind the apartment, pruning dead leaves and watering wilting flowers, I realized that growth was never a straight path but a series of small, deliberate choices to nurture life, even when it seemed pointless. Nights were the hardest when silence pressed in and memories of Emily's cold eyes haunted me, when I questioned why she had turned so cruelly. And yet even then, I discovered resilience I didn't know I possessed, the kind that allows a man to sit in the dark and decide that tomorrow he will keep walking, keep building, keep living, because despair is a visitor, not a resident. And through it all, I met people who unknowingly taught me forgiveness, empathy, and the quiet strength of endurance, like the young woman who ran a tiny coffee shop near the park and always offered me a free muffin with a smile, the retired couple who invited me to play chess on Sunday afternoons, and the stray dog I rescued, one rainy night, who followed me home and refused to leave until I let him in, reminding me that love sometimes appears in the most unexpected forms. With each passing day, my heart slowly unclenched, the anger and bitterness giving way to a tempered wisdom, the kind that does not forget the past but refuses to be ruled by it. And as I walked along the river under the stars, feeling the cool breeze on my face and listening to the faint hum of the city, I began to imagine a future where my daughter might see me not just as the father who endured betrayal, but as a man who rebuilt his life from fragments, a man whose capacity for love, patience, and kindness had only grown stronger through suffering. And even though the wounds would never fully disappear, I understood that life's worth was not measured by what had been stolen from me, but by what I chose to cultivate in the spaces left behind. A life filled with quiet victories, enduring friendships, small joys, and a relentless hope that, despite everything, tomorrow could still be brighter, and that I, Richard Miller of Denver, Colorado, was not defined by the past but by the strength, courage, and dignity with which I rose each day to greet it. As the seasons changed, life in Denver continued to teach me lessons I never thought I would need to learn. Winter arrived with its icy fingers, frosting the windows and forcing me to bundle up before stepping outside. Yet even in the biting cold, I found warmth in small, unexpected places, like the neighbor who shoveled my sidewalk without asking, the librarian who remembered my favorite books and always set them aside for me, and the way the snow muffled the city's noise, creating a rare, peaceful silence that allowed me to reflect on my life and choices. I started volunteering at a local shelter, helping those who, like me once, had been abandoned or betrayed, and with each person I assisted, each meal I served, each story I listened to, I felt the weight of my own pain lighten slightly, replaced by a purpose I hadn't known existed, a reason to keep moving forward even when the nights were long and lonely, and Emily's betrayal still gnawed at the edges of my heart. Yet in this quiet struggle I discovered resilience, not the kind that shouts in storms, but the subtle, steady kind that whispers in the morning sunlight, in the wag of a stray dog's tail, in the laughter of a child playing in the snow. And slowly I began to understand that life's meaning wasn't in grand gestures or dramatic revenge, but in the countless tiny acts of connection, kindness, and courage that build a life worth living, day by day, moment by moment. And I found myself writing letters to my daughter, not to demand explanations or plead for forgiveness, but to tell her that despite everything, I loved her and wished her well, and though she may never read them, the act of writing became a balm to my soul, a way to release the bitterness without letting it consume me, while at the same time I nurtured friendships that turned into chosen family, the coffee shop owner who became a confidant, the retired couple who taught me patience and strategy, through chess, and the stray dog now named Max, who reminded me daily that loyalty and love can exist in the simplest forms, all of which slowly wove a safety net beneath me, catching me when memories of betrayal threatened to send me tumbling. As spring approached, the snow melted into streams that ran through the city parks. The flowers bloomed with resilience I envied, and I felt a stirring in my heart that I hadn't felt in years. A quiet hope, a readiness to embrace life fully, again understanding that pain and joy coexist, that betrayal does not define the whole story, and that the measure of a man is not in how he falls, but in how he chooses to rise, rebuild, and continue loving even when it is hard. So I, Richard Miller, living in Denver, Colorado, walked through the city streets with my head held a little higher, my heart a little lighter, and a determination that the story I was writing from now on would be one of endurance, growth, compassion, and above all, unwavering hope. Summer arrived in Denver with a blaze of sunlight that seemed almost too bright for someone who had spent so many months in shadow. Yet I welcomed it, letting the warmth seep into my bones and remind me that life moves forward whether we are ready or not. I spent my mornings walking through city parks with Max trotting happily beside me, his tail wagging in a way that made me smile even when old regrets crept in, and I noticed things I had ignored before, the laughter of children, chasing after ice cream trucks, the scent of fresh bread from the bakery on 15th Street, the way the wind could carry away a heavy thought if you let it, and in those small, fleeting moments, I began to rebuild a life that felt genuinely mine again, not defined by Emily's betrayal or the cold shoulder from my daughter, but by the choices I made daily to seek connection, kindness, and understanding. I started attending local community events, sharing my story with others who had faced hardship, finding solace in the way our pain created bonds stronger than any superficial friendship ever could. And slowly, strangers became friends, and friends became family in ways I never expected, teaching me that home is not only a place but the people who walk with you through darkness and light alike. While at the same time, I began writing more frequently, letters, journals, even small essays about hope and resilience, pouring my thoughts onto paper to release the bitterness and make sense of the chaos that once seemed unbearable. And though Emily's name still made my chest tighten and my daughter's absence left a hollow ache, I realized that healing was not a single moment but a mosaic of countless small actions, each one a brick in the foundation of a life rebuilt. And as I sipped coffee in the little cafe by the river one afternoon, watching the sunlight dance on the water, I understood that the man I had been, the man consumed by anger, betrayal, and sorrow, was not gone but transformed, tempered like steel in fire, and now capable of love that was patient, deliberate, and unconditional. I even began volunteering at the local library, reading to children and helping adults with literacy programs, finding joy in watching faces light up with understanding. And through all of this, I nurtured a quiet dream that one day my daughter might understand why I had taken the path I did, and perhaps even come to find forgiveness, not just for me but for herself. And in the meantime, I continued to embrace the life I had rebuilt, cherishing each sunrise and sunset, each smile and kind word, each shared story and laugh, because I finally understood that life's true measure is not in the pain we endure or the betrayals we suffer, but in the courage we muster to keep moving forward, to keep giving, and to keep believing that love, even after loss, is always possible. And so, as Richard Miller of Denver, Colorado, I walked steadily through the streets, Max by my side, the city alive around me, and a heart full of hope that the coming days would bring more healing, more connection, and perhaps even the chance to rewrite the story with my daughter in a way that could mend what had once seemed irreparably broken.